these pseudoflowers are being formed, which parts of the pseudoflowers were the fungus itself and which parts were the plant? Is it sort of a combination of the plant, the leaves forming, and the rust fungus covers those, or is it all the plant?
Well, it wasn't addressed in this paper. This was like the first paper to really point this out. But subsequently, we have learned that it's a lot of plant tissue covered in rust. So in
Okay.
other words, the pseudoflower is actually made out of plant parts, not fungus parts.
So so the pseudoflower that the rust is forcing the host plant to grow is different from the actual plant's flower normally.
Yeah.
How is it that they're like controlling the way? How is it controlling what flower that the host plant is producing?
Like what it looks like?
Yeah, because instead of like forming like the nectar in just like one clump, it's like spreading all of like the sugar out, right?
Mm-hmm.
How is it changing the way the plant would grow? I guess is what I'm asking.
Does anyone have ideas? How would that work? Because you're getting at an important question. Like, if it was just hijacking the host plant's genome, it would be essentially telling the plant to make a flower, and that's the flower the plant knows how to make, but it's producing a different one. So, how in the world? Give me your crazy ideas.
I kind of thought that it was just like, a random mutation made the fungi able to invade the meristemic tissue, and then after that, just it affected the morphology, and just like natural selection of the flower regularly, it selected for the different changes the fungi made in the morphology.
Okay. So, what you're saying is like maybe it started out making a similar flower, but it's evolved separately over
Yeah,
time.
like
It's a
maybe
different
like
organism.
cause some to grow taller and some to be shorter, and it natural selection selected for the taller, and then color and sugar production and all that.
Okay, and it would not necessarily have to follow the same evolutionary trajectory of the host plant itself because we're talking about a fungus, and so it could go off on its kind of own pathway.
Yeah, and maybe even improve the flower's fitness.
The plant's flowers fitness or the pseudoflower fungus fitness?
Oh, the plant itself.
Mm. I think if you think about this, it's probably deleterious to the host plant because it's using all of its resources to make a fake flower for a fungus rather than make its own flowers and get pollinated and produce seeds. It's even like hijacking the fructose production, and so it's like pumping tons of valuable sugar straight into the fungus. So my supposition is that this rust is actually bad for the host that it's on.
Oh, okay.
As far as what you're saying for the fructose production, the paper was saying that most of it is the fungus producing that fructose substance. I just missed what you were saying. Is the plant still producing fructose, or is it all just from the fungus itself?
Well, where is the fungus getting the carbon to make the fructose?
Okay, so it must be coming from the plant then.
It's coming from the plant. Fungus cannot actually produce fructose.
Okay.
It can rearrange carbon to make fructose, but it's all dependent on that primary production, capture of CO2. And so it's definitely taking, in a roundabout way, fructose directly from the plant. Yeah.
Okay, so in that way, it is deleterious to the plant because it's hijacking all of its resources.
Yeah, I mean, this is a parasitic fungus growing all over the place, hijacking the resources to make fungus reproduction instead of flowers for the plant.
Dr. Zan, if I remember correctly from the paper, the flower, the pseudoflower, was made out of leaves, right, of the plant. So it wasn't an actual flower per se. It was just more the fungus took over the leaves and then arranged them in such a way that it looked exactly like a flower.
Yes.
And that's crazy. I don't know how. I mean, it would have to have some sort of mutation at some point where it developed the ability to somehow communicate with and somehow bring those leaves together. I don't know. The one thing I was thinking about, and this I thought was, I don't know, this is my idea. I thought that maybe the reason this happened also is because even though it killed the plant itself that it infected, overall the other plants, even of the same species, benefited because the fungus brought more pollinators, and so overall caused more plants to spread their pollen around, if that makes sense.
It
There's
does.
an idea. I don't know. And I was thinking like maybe that's, but I don't know how the mutation would have happened in the fungus to get to that point. I mean, it's.
Well, let's save that for a bit later, the mechanism. But
yes,
this idea of this is beneficial to the plants around it. Walk me through that again.
Yeah, so what I was thinking that because it was in the paper, it talked about how even compared to other plants that grow in the same area, the fungus is by far the most successful at attracting pollinators. So bees, flies, whatever. And so I was thinking that even though the individual plant that is infected is going to die eventually, the fact that the fungus is attracting more pollinator that will sniff that flower, but very likely will also go to the plants next to it that are supposedly of the same species. It's going to overall increase their fertility as a species, let's say, rather than an individual. So the individual will die, but the species will do fine due to the fungus. So I was thinking it's kind of, and I don't know if that's called a mutualistic relationship or not. I don't know, but since it's technically the individual is dying, but the species overall may benefit.
So this is tricky. I guess I didn't think of it that way. I looked, it was that table. I swear there was a table in there.
There was.
Yeah, visits and time on plants. So table 2. You can see that the pseudoflower has like 4 to 100 times as much sugar, right? It's got more flowers than plants that aren't infected, or essentially about the same number of flowers, actually. And then the one that struck me was the time on plants %. So when I saw this table, I was thinking, okay, the fly shows up on the infected plant, the pseudoflower, and just has a field day, right? It's running around, lapping up sugar everywhere, and it's spending all its time on that and actually less time on the surrounding plants. So I guess my thought was it's detrimental to the plants around it because it's like taking those pollinators that would otherwise be there. But I see what you're saying, whereas maybe it's actually attracting pollinators that wouldn't have been in the area before.
Exactly, that's what I was thinking, yeah.
Right.
Also because it talked about how few flowers the actual plant has. So I mean, its chance of being pollinated and reproduced and spread, I mean, it was a lot lower, while the fungus might help it out. Not the individual plant, but overall other plants.
And that might actually help explain some of the evolution, right? Like, how does this happen? How does it stay beneficial to the organisms, both of them, all the way through this long time period?
And also why the plant didn't die, because I feel like why wouldn't the fungus have just taken over and it will be dead? But somehow it survived, and doing just fine.
I see a bunch of hands.
I also,
Oh, yeah, go for it.
I also had a question about that because it did talk about like he was looking like it could affect the like reproductive success of it, but it didn't necessarily say like positively or negatively.
Yeah, it didn't
because
say
he
which
said
way.
like alternatively, like what Christina was saying is it could attract more, from how I interpret it, more like insects overall to come just like to the fungus, but then there's also neighboring flowers, so it could help it, pollinate and spread that way, or it could just take all of the insects itself. And I maybe I just didn't necessarily, and I was just wanted to ask like if it was specifying if it was negative or positive, because in the last paragraph it just said that it could potentially affect the reproductive success, but I wasn't sure if that was like a positive effect or a negative effect.
This was her first publication ever. It's like a groundbreaking, crazy one. She did this while a postdoc. And it was the first publication on this that took it seriously at all, outside of like some old reports from like old-timey journals and stuff that noticed weird-looking flowers. But she did not, at this point, have like a mechanistic understanding of how this all happened, or whether it was going to be good or bad for the plants. And so like what Christina was saying, she read this as it's probably good for the plants as a whole because it's attracting pollinators. I read it and I thought this is probably bad for the plants because all the pollinators are spending time on the fake plants. And so
Dr. Zahn, we should do a research.
maybe it's been addressed already. I don't know.
Maybe it has. I don't know. But it apparently grows in Colorado, so I'm sure it grows in Utah somewhere.
Yeah.
This would be really interesting, honestly.
I mean, if they're surviving, then it has to be at least neutral, right?
No, it could be bad. it could be
I
bad.
thought it was bad as well.
It definitely could be bad, and just think like this rust isn't like taking over the entire population of these flowers all over the world. It's like clumping up. You have little outbreaks here and there. It's worse some years than others, that kind of thing.
A question I had was, does the rust fungi completely halt any production of the host plants, like regular flowers as well, or can it do both?
It can do both. I think a lot of the energy gets put into pseudoflowers though, and so it's going to produce fewer flowers than it normally would. And I think.
But the pseudoflower attracting pollinating insects could still be beneficial to the host plant, not just the neighboring plants.
Right. But remember, the flower looks more like neighboring plants than it does like the host flower. It looks nothing like the host flower itself, and so it's probably attracting a different suite of pollinators.
Oh, I thought it did both, where like sometimes it looks like the host plant, sometimes it looks like other ones.
It looks totally wackadoo. It looks like a totally different flower. They even showed that it like figure 2. She shows like the visible spectrum of how bugs see this, and even discussed how some of these actually reflect light in the ultraviolet just like a bee would see it normally on a flower, which is super freaky to me. This is nuts. All right, I still see some hands, so just, I don't know who got there first, so just start yelling.
I was just going to say that from the part that I read, or from what I read, I saw that she mentions both that it can be problematic for neighboring plant flowers because of it outcompetes them, like the pollinators are more attracted to the pseudoflowers. And in other cases, it can be beneficial because it increases the floral display, and so it just attracts more pollinators in general to the area. And she said it also can depend on the species of plants too. how that
Yeah,
affected.
the community of plants growing around it would definitely affect whether it's beneficial or detrimental to the like site as a whole.
I had one thing of my own, but before that, Saxon Day is asking if there are multiple species of rust fungi that cause different plants to grow flowers or change them drastically in the same manner as the Arabis.
Yes. This is kind of the poster child of this. It's really showy and everything, but yes, there are other species that do this. Actually, quite a few rust fungi hijack flowers and steal pollinators, because remember, they've got to get their spermatia from one site to another, and they're heterophalic, so they've got to have that like outbreeding effect. So they do depend on insects, and so a lot of them have co-evolved with flowering plants to basically use the insects that would be showing up to the flower. This is the one that's like very flashy and showy and creates a completely fake flower kind of from scratch rather than actually just using the host flower.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I definitely couldn't see this happening in something that isn't heterophalic. This seems to require a fair bit of evolution.
I think you cut out there. But yes.
I actually kind of had something to say about that.
Okay.
I had a question about, like, when I think of this, I don't know, being such like an advanced like ability, like there's no way that it could all, you know, have been one mutational event. I feel like I don't know what your thoughts are all on that. That like maybe it just initially acquired some mutation that allowed it to like take advantage of the plant's resources more, and as a side effect, maybe that's how some of those leaves ended up clumping together, and I don't know, gave it some, you know, slight reproductive edge over other plants and rusts.
So let's see, Dalton and Matthew have their hands up, and after they've said their piece, we should move on to how this happens.
Okay. So a couple things I wanted to clarify. Just making sure in the assignment you asked us to form a hypothesis of how it would not be harming the plant, right? The host.
I wanted you to hypothesize about how this could have evolved.
Okay. Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Okay, so I've got a question, but first I just want to put that I'm on Christina's team. I also thought it was a positive effect on the plant, but my question was, so I read the whole thing, the whole article, and I summarized it. So I get like the general concepts we talked about, but the one thing that didn't make sense was when it talked about like the scientists doing tests regarding like the UV and all that kind of type stuff. Were they actually saying that the fungus changes the color? Like, does it change it yellow and it wasn't yellow before? Was that what it was getting at right there?
Yeah, well, the leaves, it's made out of leaves, and so they were green, but yes, it does change them to yellow and mimics the spectrum that bees like to see.
Oh, okay, because that's what I was thinking, but it didn't. I at least didn't see a part where it said they were green before, so I just didn't know if it was changing like the tone of the yellow or something. But I guess it was green before, and that was really obvious.
Yeah, and it did change the tone of the yellow that the plant normally makes also.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I just threw a link up in the chat. From 2013. So 20 years after the publication of this observational paper. And the title says it all. How could this have evolved? Dalton, you got your hand?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah. So what I put down, obviously there were some missing pieces I just couldn't think of, but initially I felt like the fungus infected the host, and that the host plant. When leaves die, they turn yellow. And then this, due to the community around it, attracted pollinators that for a second mistakenly thought that it was a yellow flower because it was the same color yellow. But then they left, right? Because there's no sugar or anything there. And then somehow, due to that attracted intention, it was good for the plant and good for the fungus because it was getting more, insect interaction. Yes. And so through natural selection, that yellow color and those leaves turning yellow and dying off slowly became more and more common. And how that made a leap to the fungus hijacking fructose production and making sugar, that's where I didn't know what to do or how that would happen.
All right, who else?
I don't know. I thought it was very similar to the fungus that kind of takes over, I forget what it's called, that takes over like ants and other insects, and it like kind of zombie, they call it like the zombie fungus or something, and it takes over their brain, and it can actually like force the ants to walk to a certain, like to the highest spot before it kills them. And so it made me think it was very similar in the fact that it was taking over the plant's, like, I don't know, resource center, so it could reappropriate those resources and control how they're being used. And by that, that's how it could, have more of an effect over making a pseudo flower, by kind of affecting like how those resources are going to certain sections of the plant.
Yeah, this is actually more common in nature than you might realize, like a parasite hijacking the machinery of the host to get something done. Think about wasp galls. I'm sure you've seen them on oak trees or wherever. The larval wasp is emitting chemicals that basically make the tree grow a big protective shell around it, a nice hollow area for it to live. Like, the tree doesn't want to do that. It's not normally what it does, but it's affecting the expression of different genes in that region of the tree. Agrobacterium, rhizobium, right? So these like bacteria that take over bits of plant roots and make all the legumes grow those nodules where they can fix nitrogen. Like, it's not the bacteria is like making cellulose and building a structure around itself. It's hijacking the plant's innate chemical arsenal and having it do the work for it. That's what is going on here. Is the fungus is basically kind of like the zombie ant thing, making the plant do things just slightly differently. Does that add up to you? Yeah, James?
I'm not sure how related this is to the rest of the discussion, but one thing I find striking about this factor of fungi altering the transcriptome of their host is this sounds like it could be useful from a perspective, we use viruses all the time to alter the or aspects of viral defenses, more accurately, to alter the genomes of bacteria and yeast artificial chromosomes. I assume that there could be research done into the mechanisms being performed by these parasites that could be used for some kind of bioengineering. Sounds like at least something that would be worth researching.
I think you're onto something there. I mean, if you, on that second paper I just sent over, if you just look at the figures, figure 1, right? It's the pretty picture. The nice purpley flowers of this plant turned into a giant stalk of yellow, sticky sugar stuff, right? Just with some regulation of the transcriptome, like what's getting transcribed in that area. Why couldn't we do that to make, I don't know, gigantic apples or extra sugar in our strawberries, something like that?
Would that even work at this point with all the polyploidy?
Probably.
I think it would too, because it's affecting the way that what genes are being expressed.
Yeah.
Not so much the genome itself and how it's reproduced or regulated. So
yeah, it's not changing the genome, it's changing what instructions are being used from the genome, in what way. So how does this evolve? Knowing now that, like we do, that this is hijacking host mechanisms.
Well, I thought it had to have been something like there had to have been an environmental condition happening that, you know, either just made it so what was happening was outcompeting, you know, the normal version. And so that's why I was thinking, like, initially, you know, maybe it was just taking advantage more of the resources. I don't know how it happened, but whatever happened.
I don't know either.
Yeah, it took root. Yeah, it took root. Took root because it gave some type of most likely reproductive advantage over the other.
Okay, well, think rust fungi have been co-evolving with flowering plants for, you know, 400 million years. We've had a lot of time to work with this. All across the rust phylogeny are species that have found ways to use flowers of their plants to do their breeding for them, just like flowering plants do. And so if you're a rust fungus, a plant is already attracting pollinators. This is perfect for you. Like, really, you just have to take better advantage of the fact that pollinators are already showing up to your home. Okay, you need them also. You don't necessarily have to make any sugar for them or anything. If you do, it's going to be better for you, but just the fact that you're on a flowering plant, you're going to have some visitation by insects. If you're in the right spot, your chances of getting visited are even better. If you start attacking the host plant with all of your biochemical weapons, which you're doing anyway, because you're a parasite, some of those may force the plant to respond, kind of like an immune response. Think of it that way. The plant has been evolving with these fungi, so its distant ancestors, thousands of plant species, all that good stuff, to protect themselves from these fungi. And so there's these cascading like pathways. When they detect that they're being attacked by a rust, there's a response, and they start shooting out chemicals. Now, this zigs and zags back and forth. It's just like any host-parasite relationship, coevolution over time, kind of that arms race thing. And before long, the fungus is able to use those defenses that the plant's spitting out at it against the plant, or it changes something that the fungus is expressing. So this is like a soup of biochemical warfare going on. The chances that one of these weapons that's being shot back and forth happens to change the plant's phenotype to make a bit more sugar are pretty high. Right. Once you get that, now suddenly you're getting more insects, and so that gets selected for. Okay, so natural selection sees that it's beneficial for the fungus, so it says, yeah, we'll keep that. Whatever's going on that makes more sugar. Okay, so I would assume that that was probably one of the first volleys in the evolution of this crazy pseudoflower. If you look at this paper, it's showing like all the different transcriptomic stuff that's changing. We've got inhibition of flower development. We've got alternation of vascular patterning, alteration of auxin, wax, and sugar. Okay, so it's like using stuff the plant already knows how to do and just altering the way that that's expressed. And so the plant knows how to make fructose out of air, okay, and sunlight. It can do that. It knows how to put that fructose into a flower, and so all the chemistry for doing that process is already there. The fungus is just flipping a little switch and pumping it to a different location. Any other thoughts on this paper? I made you read the original one rather than the one 20 years later, because it's awesome. I think it's a bit more readable also. And it still has the mystery.
Yeah, I got a question real quick. On the top right side of the paper, it looks like the second paragraph down. It says infected plants from which insects were excluded remained yellow and continued to produce nectar, whereas those that were visited made sexual spores, turned to green, and stopped producing nectar. So I'm just confused. Is it an infected plant already that's being visited and then making sexual spores and then turned back to green?
Remember, we've got like the surface of the leaf, and if you remember our rust, they form those little divots in the leaves and put out spermatia. Once the spermatia cross over to a receptive hyphae, now it's dikaryotic, and so it can undergo sex. And so it grows to the other side of the leaf. Whole bunch of genetic switches get flipped when the fungus is dikaryotic. Okay, so it no longer has to spend its time trying to attract insects to do the mating. That part's done. Okay. It's going to grow to the other side of the leaf and make esiospores.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So it's an actual infected plant that's already turned yellow, and now it's turning back because it no longer needs the yellow brightness to attract other insects. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How common are these fungi in our area? Like, are they something that we would be able to find?
Yeah, you'd be able to find these. The person to talk to is Erin Riggs, our herbarium director. She's got quite a database of plants, like GPS even. So you could go in there and ask her about this, and she'd be able to give you GPS coordinates for all the known spots where these plants occur, and you could definitely.
Sweet, that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. John, this is kind of more on like the first the first paper. But by definition, wouldn't a parasite, it's taking nutrients and things from its host at the expense of its host? So wouldn't it not necessarily, if we're taking like the positive route, that it's, could potentially be a good thing for this species of flower? Like wouldn't it be classified more as like a symbiosis rather than a parasite?
Well, the parasite at the individual plant level, this is definitely bad for that individual plant. I think what people were suggesting is that maybe it's beneficial for the population as a whole, the ones that aren't infected but are still getting a benefit of increased insect arrival. I'm not sure I buy that because these flowers look so different. It's probably more likely to benefit other plant species that are nearby if we're going to go with that beneficial route. Even then, my skepticism says that the insects are spending so much time on these like sugar packets that probably the plants around them aren't getting, they're not getting the same amount of visitation. That was pointed out in the paper. And even the insects that were there and would have been hanging out on these plants, probably going to be attracted away from them to this giant yellow pile of sugar. So I don't know, I'm skeptical, but then again, I don't know that it's been tested or not. But definitely at the individual plant level, this is
Sweet, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I was thinking about while responding to the first paper was that, is it absolutely necessary that this parasite has always been detrimental to the host plant, or perhaps during parts of its development was it more mutualistic, particularly if we're going with that idea that the first thing to evolve was the greater production of sugar? That sounds like it could have benefited both the host and the parasite. Is this an example of the adaptations over time have led to a point where it's more detrimental to the plant and at the expense of the plant and more beneficial to the parasite? I'm not 100% sure where my train of thought is going with this, but basically it could have been more mutualistic historically, and that's why this thing that's really detrimental is still something that exists. Because if I understand correctly, lethality is not something you want to evolve as a species, because you will work yourself out of a job.
Correct.
Basically.
Yeah, and rusts are pretty good at that, having the two host life cycle. They tend to avoid that lethality dilemma, right? Because they're just switching from host to host, never killing one off entirely. So I don't know, is my answer, whether rust fungi began as a mutualism and switched to a pathogen relationship, but it's very plausible. We see that all across the the host parasite spectrum. A lot of these are kind of balanced on a knife edge of, is it parasitic or mutualistic, and they can switch over time. Self-interest is a sloppy term, but think of it that way. Like, it's the fungus doesn't care what happens to the plant. Evolution does not have any foresight, so it can absolutely select for deleterious stuff, right? It can say, okay, here, you're going to be really good at killing plants, and then you go extinct, right? That's evolution just not thinking ahead. It never does. And so it's very possible that what we're seeing now is how to put this, I guess, tipped over that edge of balancing between commensal mutualism and parasitism. It's never stable in nature. You spend enough time, like a few million years, looking at a system, and it's going to be switching back and forth constantly. I don't know if that answered your question or made it totally worse, but
no, it makes sense. And here I thought humans were the only species that was capable of not having foresight when using exorbitant selfishness to mess ourselves up. Huh.
No, we're not alone there. We're in good company. Yeah. It's definitely the rule out there. All right, well, good chat, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this paper. I thought it was really fun. I remember reading this one in grad school and totally freaking out about it. So next up, what are we doing next? Endophytes. So we'll look at, no, not endophytes, not yet, sorry. Distribution and dispersal. Okay, so Basigalupe, this is a paper about chytrids and climate change. And so we're going to look at how fungi get around, how they wind up, and whether or not they have population structure and what that looks like. All right. Adios.
Thank you, Dr. Zahn.
Unless you got any
Thank
other
you.
questions. All right.
Thanks,
See ya.
Dr. Zahn.
Thanks, Dr. Zahn.
See you next week. Have a good weekend.